The Fantasy Animation Podcast takes its listeners on a journey through the colliding and sometimes competing worlds of fantasy storytelling and the medium of animation. Each episode, we select an example of fantasy animation and consider the ways in which it functions to inspire and use our imaginations within the sphere of all things that are sculpted, composed, crafted, and drawn. To help support the show, please subscribe via your podcast feed and give us a like and a quick review. It takes no more than a minute, but it really helps us to grow our audience. You can also find our archive of podcasts and our weekly blog at fantasy-animation.org. You'll find the latest reviews there, features, editorials, all written by academics, writers, historians and professional animators working within these overlapping media, mediums and genres. Failing all that, tell your friends, tell a friend about the show and the good work we do here. There's no substitution for good old-fashioned word of mouth, so thanks for downloading, and I really hope you enjoy the show. Everybody, Happy New Year and welcome to the latest edition of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I remain in 2022 Alex Sargent.
And I will see you yesterday, Chris Holliday.
And we're invoking time travel because this episode we are time traveling again. We've time traveled before. We're likely to time travel again. This is the sort of thing we get up to on the podcast. But the act of time traveling has never quite felt so important or as political as it does with our chosen film for today in the form of the Netflix produced and released drama See You Yesterday, a story which blends sci-fi adventure, family melodrama and urban reality to a devastating and poetic effect. For me as a fantasy historian and theorist, it's a story that asks a series of questions we've asked a bunch of times on the podcast about who gets to imagine in society, what the role of the imagination can play, both on a kind of, lofty poetic sense, but also on a very real lived in sense, who the protagonists of such stories can be. And also, I guess, with time travel, imagining futures and past and what that might mean for different social categories and things like that. So I've got loads to talk about. Chris, those interested in animation and VFX, what have they got to look forward to this week?
So there's a couple of sort of moments of CG virtual holograms and sort of visual effects within the narrative. I suppose I've got little notes on the role of children, which I imagine kind of ties fantasy and animation together, specifically in this episode. Also the kind of use of media. I was really struck by sort of the use of video camera, CCTV footage of black bodies and maybe how that plays historically to some kind of troubling themes that the film then goes on to explore. And also kind of overlaps between Afrofuturism, which is something we've sort of talked a little bit about on the podcast, and kind of puzzle film narratives. And actually Afrofuturism is something that I think connects quite nicely to our special guest's research interest. So I'm really excited to take Afrofuturism and sort of throw it to our guest for this instalment.
Well, let's get on to introduce our guest then. The cliche is she deserves no introduction because listeners will be very familiar with her work. I cite it all the time on the podcast. This is very much, let's put a voice to the name. We are joined by Dr. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, who is an associate professor in the Joint Program in English and Education at the University of Michigan. She's the author of numerous articles and books examining race and representation in children and young adults literature, including her most recent book, The Dark Fantastic. Listeners will be intimately familiar with it because, as I say, it's a real touchstone text on this podcast. Race and Imagination, from Harry Potter to the Hunger Games, which received the 2020 World Fantasy Award. Ebony, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to spending this hour with both of you.
Well, ditto. Looking forward, and I guess we, to use the pun, looking backwards, because this is a movie that is looking backwards in two ways, I guess. It's a film about time travel and the importance of looking the importance of the past and the sort of the way time travel can interact with the present. But it's also a movie that kind of nods its or tips its hat to a number of seminal time travel classics. Not least, we've got Michael J. Fox doing a cameo in the movie, and I believe his sort of last role in the film. So it's a really fun movie, but it's also a really, really important movie, I think, in many ways. So perhaps we could start, if you don't mind, by just telling listeners why we asked you to pick the movie. You've picked this one. Why this movie, and how does it fit within your broader sort of interests and research?
So, See You Yesterday was released 2 years ago, and it was a time that I thought I would never see in my life, which was the English language fantastic and speculative tradition telling whimsical stories about Black kids and communities here in the States. I was really thrilled to hear about it. So several friends told me about it once it dropped on Netflix. And it took a while before I was able to sit down and really take it in. And at the time, I was still am revising a novel I've been working on for 20 years. So every single English major is either sitting on a collection of short stories, poetry, or we're all writing the same novel over and over, because you really haven't published until you've published fiction or poetry or some form, that's literary, right? No matter all the academic writing that we do. So I have been obsessed with time travel since I was a little girl. There was a 1986 Disney film that I used to think was obscure until the internet and social media were invented. And then every single Generation Xer or early millennial had seen this film. It's called Flight of the Navigator. You're nodding.
I'm nodding vigorously. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I bet you are, Alex. I bet you are. Yeah.
But that was one of the reasons why I immediately loved See You Yesterday, because not only do I love time travel with an eerie element, but also I love time loops. And that was the very thing I have been stumbling on in my own fictional work, which is I'm an academic and not a novelist yet, because it's really difficult to make those things work. And then the final reason I chose this film was because it seems as if, as I said in the dark fantastic, it is difficult to break the dark other out of this cycle of spectacle, hesitation, haunting, and violence. And so even in this film that, should be escapist or should be whimsical fun, there's lots of humor in it, you still have some of the most pressing questions of race and racism in the West embedded in the very heart of the plot. So for all those reasons, I just thought See You Yesterday was compelling enough to chat about for an hour.
I reckon you're going to be spot on with that. I've got lots of notes about it, and I'm really fascinated to what you've got to your take on the movie, because I mean, I guess we can do the plot synopsis in just a second, but just to kind of bounce around it for a bit. One of the things that struck me, and as you were saying about time loops, is comparing it with something like Back to the Future, which you can't help but do because the film even asks you to kind of do that. Absolutely. There's this kind of very racialized awareness one arrives at when you compare a time loop like something like Back to the Future, which is very much a story of kind of, I guess, this film reframes it very much as a kind of story about kind of a privileged version of time travel, where the only thing they have to worry about is whether Marty's dad's gonna own the massive car by the end of it, and the kind of what's at stake when doing time travel. And there's Back to the Future is always talked about as kind of a very nostalgic text because it travels, it celebrates the 1950s culture, and there's this time loop which is about as much a celebration of the past as it is kind of celebration of the present. And when you take that story and reframe it like See You Yesterday does, suddenly a time loop becomes a far more depressing notion, because of course Black subjectivity's relationship to past and present and the idea of progress and the idea of nostalgia is all very, very, very different when it's set in Brooklyn and not in Hill Valley. So yeah, we could start with that, maybe, how this film kind of treats the subject of time looping as actually a rather kind of bleak thing, because these characters are desperate to try and break out of a cycle that eventually the film kind of traps them within. Well, there's an ending that's kind of ambiguous, right? But yeah, talk to me about time loops and how time loops play into your understanding of this movie.
So, one of the things that I find most intriguing about the time loop is that while Back to the Future jumps back about 3 decades, See You Yesterday is literally about the near past and the near future. So, the expanse of the time loop is constrained in really interesting ways. And I'm still thinking that through because I haven't, yet really gone back to the film to think about how time is played with or is itself a character. I've just fangirled it and used it as, as an amateur storyteller, just thinking about, okay, well, how is this working as plot device? But I think the nature of time itself in the film is really interesting. The screenwriters and Spike Lee, who's the producer who picked it up, the two young screenwriters met each other, I believe, at Tisch or I'm trying to remember what I read of their story. But when they met, they were talking about themes. So time travel, Black Lives Matter, and, setting things in the local. So I think that while a lot of time travel novels or films, narratives tend to play with the long expanse of time or a time loop. This is constrained in both space time. So it's, the place is constrained. So it's hyper local, Brooklyn. And then also the time is, you're just looking at the span of a relatively short span. I mean, is it a week?
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember.
So
it's about
only a week. Yeah, that they managed to go back to.
That's intriguing. I mean, it would have been a very different choice, right? To have the Calvin, so sorry in advance to any listeners for spoilers, but Calvin, CJ, the girl protagonist brother, is killed in an act of police brutality. And it would have been very interesting, I mean, not at all, I'm Black American. Of course, this is not, I'm not saying that's interesting, but, it would have been interesting from a storytelling point of view had this happened when she was little, and then she's going back a decade. Or that this is an ancestor that was killed. That's Octavia Butler's kindred, or there's the trauma is ancestral. This is trauma that happened yesterday. And it's so clever that that's embedded right in the title. And I just think that represents some of the things that I was talking about in the Dark Fantastic. Like, before I came up with the cycle, I turned in an article that got rejected. It was like sort of a soft reject. And I called it the sticky problem of the Dark Fantastic before I thought about it as a cycle, because I told one of my senior colleagues, I was like, Black characters are getting stuck in Western speculative fiction. They're getting stuck. My colleague said, but you need a better word than getting stuck. You're an academic. But I see this here, right? So CJ and Sebastian, there's constraint to their movement. I feel, even in something as whimsical and supposedly as limitless as time travel. So that's just really, really odd and intriguing to think about.
In terms of the Dark Fantastic then and sort of the stickiness with which the film deals at the level of plot, one of the things that sort of we've done previously on this podcast, we've done Black Panther, and when this film started, when See You Yesterday started, it felt like it was picking up a few minutes after the end of Black Panther, because Black Panther ends with the establishment of a kind of outreach centre for children. And what I really liked about this film was that it sort of picks up immediately with these two child protagonists who are essentially these scientific proteges who are going to sort of change the world, but first they need to change this very, as you say, very narrow, constrained period of time. So I actually wanted to ask you about the role of, because I was watching this thinking, well, this is just, this feels Afrofuturist, but of course it's not quite. And then I went back to the Dark Fantastic and was looking at the way that you sort of position the Dark Fantastic into something like Afrofuturism, which often accounts for quite a lot under that banner of we are now entering Afrofuturism, or this is an Afrofuturist text, or this is now Afro-pessimist, or whatever it is, these sorts of big labels. And so thinking about the film as it felt like these children could have come out of that outreach program established at the end of Black. There was something quite nice about the relationship between these two films. But I just wondered, because I suppose I would think of it, oh, well, this is an Afrofuturist text because it's about Black subjectivity combined with Black possibility. It's sort of about progressive, the progressive nature of Black techno cultures. This sort of using the tropes of science fiction to present Black subjectivity. So I just wondered, how does this film is very much a dark fantastic text rather than Afrofuturist text, or where do you sort of see that relationship? Because I know it kind of plays out in your book, but it'd be great to sort of see where the film fits into that kind of relationship.
Right. So, Chris, you really make a great point that I hadn't thought of, because one of the things I've been doing as a critic is positioning most speculative storytelling for youth and young adults with Black characters post Black Panther as part of this Afrofuturistic renaissance.
Yeah.
But I also wrote an article after the Dark Fantastic, because one of the things I've heard from other Black critics, and I actually own this criticism, is that I did not attend to or highlight Black authored texts. However, Black creatives who have grown up in the West also both subvert and adhere to the Dark Fantastic cycle. I actually wrote a whole article about this, but it's an academic article. I think that one was called Notes Toward a Black Fantastic. And what I did was I looked at, there seems to be Black death as a sticking point within so much of the Western fantastic. Now, friends who study these things more broadly would say, well, inherent in storytelling is the need for conflict. And what is higher stakes than death, right? So, like, of course, this is not about race. This might be about, something else. But I just think it's very interesting that I could have traced the Dark Fantastic cycle in stories even written by Black creators or other creators of color, because we have all been inculcated with Western mythology, folklore, science fiction, and fantasy that sees the dark other as monstrous. And so you are constantly fighting against and also reaffirming your own internal programming, I think.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense, because I think part of what your book gets at and what your wider writing gets at is this kind of unpicking of a wider storytelling convention. I mean, fantastic literature is a byproduct of sort of European Enlightenment rationality and colonial structures, right? So it's that makes complete sense that actually the problem it's not just an individual problem. It's how does one write a text within a generic framework and embrace a generic framework that can, that has a fan base and is wonderful and rich and we can enjoy it, and that's why we're doing things like podcasts and things, chatting about it. But at the same time, it's kind of so indebted to these structures that it's difficult to kind of write your way out of them whilst writing within them, right? You're swimming in the seas and it's difficult not to get wet. So yeah, I think the film, I think the film's great, and I think it's really interesting. But I also struggle with this question of, I guess the question is, how self-reflexive is the film being about these tropes? I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, but on the story is, for listeners, the story is very much sort of about this sort of inevitability of violence, and this isn't just a sort of a Black phenomenon. It reminded me actually of that movie, The Butterfly Effect, which is not a movie I wanted to think about on a Monday morning, but hey, I did. And that as a movie about kind of, he tries to save, I can't even remember, it's Ashton Kutcher, he tries to save, or make up for the atones of the past, and he ends up realizing he may as well not have bothered because it just brings further hurt and misery to everyone. And there's a certain similar logic to this movie, right? The main heroine tries to save her brother, who is a victim of police brutality, and the more she tries to save him, the more people suffer along the way, and the more kind of innocent people die, as well as her brother. And there's a inevitably structure. So yes, it's a film that kind of plays with this idea of the inevitability of violence and the inevitability of white violence against Black youth. And I just wonder, like, is it a story that we might lament because it can't imagine a way of doing time travel that doesn't involve these issues? Or is it a movie that is using that to say something self-reflexive about, you know, the inevitability of these things within Black urban society when history is both there and not there at the same time? An unfair, impossible question, but I'll ask it anyway. What do we do you have any thoughts?
I have plenty of thoughts. It's not unfair at all.
Good. No, well, that's good.
And as both a critic and researcher, and then as a would-be storyteller, wrestling with trying to write this, you know, epic novel where you're thinking about, well, where would you set something that escapes the dark fantastic cycle? So one, you know, so See You Yesterday shows its inevitability. So thinking about alternatives. So I've seen authors set their stories in the far future. So, but how far in the future do you have to go in order to shake off the detritus from the present? Like Star Trek is not far enough. And I'm a huge Trekkie. I'm an open and public Trekkie. I have a Star Trek Twitter. And sometimes Paramount, you know, evil corporations, but Paramount sometimes sends me stuff because that's how loud of a Trekkie I am. However, I do not feel that in 200 years we will have solved every single social problem that we currently have, nor do I believe that we will ever invent warp drive, at least not within the next few millennia, nor will we meet anthropomorphic aliens like who we can, you know, I don't think that any of
it's gonna be a fun 200 years if we are.
Yeah.
Here come the Vulcans.
Yeah.
So that's one, you know, so you got the far future. Then you have the problem of alternate universes or trying to dream of alternate alterities. The best one that I've ever read is Stephen Barnes's Lion's Blood duology, which imagines an alternate, you know, colonization. So it was part and parcel of like sort of an early 2000s wave toward reimagining like a non-Western present. Orson Scott Card wrote Past Watch, The Redemption of Christopher Columbus. Kim Stanley Robinson wrote The Years of Rice and Salt. So they were imagining different, so these are these mainstream sci-fi folks who are reimagining what the conquest. Then you had Patricia Reed's 13th Child, which was rightly critiqued by Native scholars and critics because it imagined a new world Western Hemisphere where there were no humans. So humans never discovered the Western Hemisphere. So it was wide open for European colonization. And so that was rightfully, critiqued as problematic, just erasing, because I mean, if you try to, imagine an alternate universe where Europe just, like 90% of people were wiped out during the Black Death or during the bubonic plague in Europe, you could only be KSR, Kim Stanley Robinson, and write that book and get it published. If I were to write it, publishers would say, well, what do you mean? This makes me feel uncomfortable. So thinking about the erasures that would be necessitated in order for our timeline not to happen. And also the suspension of disbelief that is required for us to imagine alternate time loops from See You Yesterday, like you said it, in the far future where everyone is just blended up, or where we've just magically gotten over it because of the Vulcans in Star Trek, or do you do what Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham did in the amazing Leviathan Wakes and just say, this is just literally going to get worse until it unravels. So the next move is to mine the asteroid belt. And here is how inequality is reproduced. so people think that's depressing, but I think that the Expanse television series and of course the book series, it's like so comforting because this is the universe that I know and believe. And I can imagine, class and race and gender and sexuality based oppressions, evolving into the oppression of the Belters in 400 years. So just thinking about the expanse of science fiction and then fantasy, which is really what I like more, although I'm talking about science fiction today, you have the issue of racialization of magical creatures, beings, and races that we could get into. So it's like, well, maybe you could reconstruct a metaphor. And every time, these are huge giants of the field, people as diverse as, or disparate, I should say, as Ursula Le Guin to George R.R. Martin. They keep saying, well, I had the wizard characters or the elf characters or the special characters. They were supposed to have dark skin and be Black. The Targaryens, Martin claims, were meant to be Black originally. But you keep running against the Western readerly imagination or the imagination of the Western audience that cannot unsee everything that's happened over the past half millennium. I think that that's a barrier. It's almost like the speed limit of the galaxy, which is the speed of light. So now that this has happened, it's like, this is something that I can't believe I'm saying on a podcast, but I've been thinking. I said, well, we can't walk it back as much as, just like the Etruscans and the Celts could not walk back the Roman Empire. And Central Asia could not walk back, and Eastern Europe couldn't walk back the Khanate. We can't walk back Western, civilization or Western expansion, the transatlantic slave trade, and the genocide of the Western Hemisphere. We can't walk, there's no way, and that's what a good time loop fiction does. It orients us toward what we can do in the here and now. It's very presentist. It's about time travel, but a time loop story is really presentist and hitting us over the head with, what we should be doing now.
Well, I love what you said about the kinds of erasures that would be needed or required to arrange those kinds of timelines or sort of genealogies or whatever it is. But this is why I think the film is so kind of genius in the way that it uses that immediate time loop narrative. It's not trying to take us too far out of the present, and it's sort of. That's exactly when we talk about race and when we talk about racist acts, we tend to gravitate towards the big seismic events rather than the day-to-day quotidian elements of racialized confrontation or tensions that play out. And almost the film dramatizes that by having its problems replay over a series of, or as you said, this quite narrow time frame. It reminds us that these events and encounters and frustrations occur in these kinds of spaces rather than a big monumental event like a Rodney King or a George Floyd. These sorts of day to day, and that's what I really liked about the film, how it really mined. Because I'm similarly fascinated by time travel and time loop stories, and that's why I really enjoyed how the film kind of marked a culmination for me between the puzzle film, however broad we want to define the puzzle film, and this sort of Afrofuturist sensibility, and then suddenly this film goes, well, of course, if you are going to embrace certain themes about the using technology to embrace a set of voices that have been sort of, I think Derry calls them, these sorts of voices who have been deliberately rubbed out, energies that have been consumed by the search for legible traces to imagine possible futures. The puzzle film's the perfect narrative structure on which to hang that kind of desire, that kind of impetus, and I wondered, I don't know, but I was trying to think of Hollywood films or films where a sort of Afrofuturist or quasi-Afrofuturist sensibility unfolds within the context of a puzzle film or a narrative where we have these sorts of loops, because it would seem a really great opportunity. These things seem to go really hand in hand with each other. Of course, if you want to tell a story about how to imagine possible futures, you embrace that kind of narrative structure. But then, as Alex said earlier, it's sort of the futility of that within the context of this film. It's some films take as their narrative premise the desire to have a car and an almanac, and this film is sort of the real meat and potatoes of what time travel within this context might mean. So I really liked that collision between kind of science fiction tropes that have their links to the Afrofuturism, and then obviously kind of connecting up to the dark fantastic. But then, of course, the Hollywood's expansion of that kind of time travel, and as we're now in this sort of multiverse era of intellectual property colliding, it just seemed a really interesting film to be able to kind of manage or marry together those kinds of themes with that sort of narrative structure.
Yeah, I was also struck, just to add to what you're saying, Chris, is that what they're trying to do, as you say, so rather than trying to get an almanac or trying to get a new car, what they're trying to do is save I forget the heroine's name, but the heroine's, this is Chris's
Jay's
job,
brother,
right?
Calvin. Yeah.
Calvin, we're trying to save Calvin from this act of brutality by the police by being wrongfully shot because they think he's reaching for a gun. A very, a all too familiar story. And then what they do is they go, okay, so we'll fix the small problem. We'll stop them getting having a confrontation with the police, and that will fix that. And what they end up doing what it exposes, and this is where I think the film is quite self-reflective, is if that act of time traveling exposes the kind of glacial logic of racism, which is that actually, fine, you stop them confronting the thing, but then you cause an unmistaken tragedy further back down the line because time is built on other things, and history is built on a previous trauma, and it just moves the problem back 2 hours and makes the problem even bigger by trying to save oneself from one trauma. One exposes a perhaps even bigger trauma embedded within the past. So I love that it's almost like time is like I don't know, a sort of piece of slate or something that you kind of break at it, and the shards reveal itself to be there and present and built upon one another. So I think in that way the film is engaging with quite a pessimistic but important understanding that the present is built upon these series of traumas that kind of sit upon one another, and to try to solve one is to reveal another one, and you can't. There's only so far you can keep going back, right? Because you could almost play this film out for like 10 hours and it would become absurdist, and they'd have to travel back to sort of, to stop Christopher Columbus arriving in America, almost to sort of, as you say, to really stop the problem. Where does the problem stop? And
that's because the individual problem is solvable, but the institutional one is not. So that's what the film is dramatizing. That sort of, the characters can solve. CJ and Sebastian can solve an individual instance of a figure on a program at a funeral. They can solve the individual problem, but the real problem is the police. They need to go back, as you say, keep going back and back and back. So I like that sort of that reflexive handling, that an individual situation is solvable and manageable, whereas the broader, as we know, this sort of institutional problem is not solvable, and that's really where the film, I think, obtains most of its power.
What does this film therefore encourage us to imagine? Because part of what fantasy seems to be able to do as a genre, that if there's a way of thinking through these, centuries-old racialized conventions, is that it needs to do better for for Black readers of all ages, but if we're talking about young adult fiction, young Black readers, and I've heard you say this elsewhere in sort of other talks that are available online, that sort of it needs to do better for sort of inspiring young Black kids to imagine. So I wonder what the film, that's where I am left with the movie, is that does the film offer any kind of optimism in what it encourages people to imagine beyond this, or is it pessimism, or is it bleakness ultimately that how do we get out of this? If we're stuck in a time loop, what do we do?
One of the things I think the writers of See You Yesterday are helping us think through is maybe there is nothing to do, because one of the things that strikes me about CJ is that she is a genius. So one of the things that I know that is fantastic about the film is not necessarily its very mundane setting. So this is the Black everyday, but you have fantastic, characters. So CJ and Sebastian are geniuses. So they've been able to do something that teams of adult scientists working for centuries have not yet done, which is to invent a viable time travel machine. And of course, there's an element of fantasy there. Not saying that, like our kids are smart, they love, science and experimentation, and they're creative. And so I would say that CJ she's smart, she's fun, she's got a mouth on her, she just, is bold, is brave, but she's all of those things and still can't stop her brother's death. And then the ending of the movie actually sat very uncomfortably with Black women who I know, some observers. It felt as if it was yet another time that Black women, and in this case, Black little girls, have to fix everything and, be everything, and it's still not okay. It's our best isn't good enough. And so I think that the message that the film gives is actually not as depressing as, some of my friends thought. I mean, I loved it at first, and then I listened to some of my friends who are writers and critics and thought, okay, yeah, I see how you viewed it. And now I'm back at, well, there's comfort in knowing that there is nothing that we as individual humans can do or learn or say in order to break systems that are half a millennium old. It will take collective action, continued collective action in the now, in the present. It's going to take a long time, and there will be casualties that we just can't fix. And I know that sounds really depressing, but one of the things that I love the most about fantasy and science fiction is that its authors don't really lie to us in their fiction. More even than realism, I think that the fantastic tells us some fundamental truths about not just human nature, because I feel like a lot of my fellow critics talk about, think about human nature and what it tells us about the self, but it also tells us something about how we are in relation to one another, because I believe that is how the self is fundamentally constructed. If you were the only person in the universe, I think you would be something very different than a self, than an individual. I think that, how relationships work and how we interact one to another, that's what I find most interesting about the genre. And even if the characters are all, non-human, you find that. And here we're finding that even it does not matter how outstanding of an individual CJ is. And she is outstanding. She's truly a classic YA protagonist. She can't cheat time, but, I think the film is even moving us to think more deeply than time. She cannot break the structure through, her intellect, through her cunning, or through her will. It's beyond her. And so I think that can potentially be very affirming, depressing, sure, but also affirming to know that, no, it's not some deficit idea about little Black girls that, what is happening to them is all their fault. And if they were just more, that the situation would change. So that's how I read it.
Before we came on, I said to Alex, so I really enjoyed the film, and I felt, I said, felt it could be longer. I really would enjoy it to be 20 minutes longer. And then actually,
no one said that about a movie in about 10 years. So
it's
an interesting, it's a good point.
But it made me think, as you were just talking, I was thinking about a version of this story where you have 20 minutes, half an hour, that missing 20 minutes that I pined for about 45 minutes ago. You'd have that at the beginning, and it would be her discovering that she can do these things. There'd be a few scenes in the classroom. She'd cheat on a test and get away with it. All this. There'd be a scene in the cafeteria at school where people call her a nerd. And what I loved about it actually is ultimately that the film cuts all that nonsense out, and the first shot is, she's a genius, let's just get on with the film, because the film is not really interested in that in a way that other kinds of movies of this perhaps nature are. And I liked the fact that the film begins with this sort of CCTV footage witnessing, kind of spying on black bodies. But what I really liked was how it inverts the sort of. So there's lots and lots of. I liked the fact that almost these characters were taking a kind of long-standing tradition of black bodies viewed through ultimately now CCTV cameras, but also phone cameras, and of course we know the importance of that sort of footage and the idea of surveillance. And flip it round, they're performing for this CCTV footage, and that provides. There was an inversion of how a camera, a surveillance, how black bodies might be surveyed in particular kinds of ways. And I like the fact that the film just got on with it. It didn't need the preamble and allowed her to just be that kind of character. But I absolutely agree. The ending, I wasn't too sure. I don't know how I feel about the ending.
It feels like perhaps what the film does politically is this thing that I always wrestle with and try to write when I write about fantasy myself, is this sort of, I always see fantasy almost like I see 1950s melodramas, in that, like, if you read most 50s melodramas and acknowledge the final sort of minute and a half of the movie, you kind of have to acknowledge that you know, bigger than life ends with a lovely happy family, rather than it being a film about, you know, a crisis of masculinity or the insanity of the household and all this sort of stuff. But if you just go, well, okay, but bear in mind that's only 90 seconds of footage, and what is the effective experience of the rest of it, you actually find out what the movie's really about. And it always annoys me. I mean, here it is, everyone. I do an episode of reference to The Wizard of Oz, and here it's coming. So The Wizard of Oz, you know, if people tell me that The Wizard of Oz is a film that celebrates home, I just ask them to rewatch it, because it's a movie that powerfully creates an effective experience of being over the rainbow. And so much of the vitality and joy and pleasure of The Wizard of Oz is in other spaces. So for me to call the movie a film, a celebration of home, just because that's what she says in the final kind of few seconds of the movie, is to do a disjustice to the whole reason you go and watch The Wizard of Oz. You don't go watch The Wizard of Oz for the bits in Kansas. You go watch The Wizard of Oz for the bit in Technicolor. And that's what the movie's kind of really conjuring within the spectator. So I wonder if we could say something similar about this movie. The movie, you know, is conjuring a kind of imaginative desire for something that isn't this, whilst at the same time acknowledging that this is what we've got right now. And I'm reminded of, actually, perhaps we could call it almost aspirational rather than inspirational in terms of how it deals with the imagination, because I was struck by the beginning of there's a throwaway line, but they say why they're trying to invent this time travel machine, and it isn't. They don't invent it to save her brother. That comes later. They invent it, they say, because they want a scholarship and they want to go to college. And it just, again, not to continually compare this to Back to the Future, but it just reminded me so much of course. So in Back to the Future, we have a rich white guy. It's said I think in the film, he's sort of has inherited an estate, and he's just sort of pottering around inventing things because he has the time, the luxury, the wealth to sit there and just do it because he can. So that might be what we call like an inspirational, you know, one pursues a time travel machine because why not? Because I've got the time, the space, the power, the luxury to do so. But these kids are doing it because they need to get to college, and they want something to get there. So it's an aspirational form of inquiry rather than an inspirational form of inquiry. So I wonder if we could think of the film like that. I don't know, like the film ends on a note of aspiration without offering any kind of, and to compare it to another movie in this lengthy soliloquy, I happened to watch King Richard yesterday, the biopic of Richard Williams and Serena Williams and Venus Williams, which is a movie very much doing exactly what this film could have done and shouldn't do, which is that, you know, that black exceptionalism that could be embodied within the main character, right? Of you can get out of Compton if you work hard enough and if you try hard enough and if you have a plan, rather than it being any kind of structural impediment to do so. So, yeah, that note of aspiration might have an important political power in black fantasy, because that might be a way of getting our way out of this cycle. I don't know, Ebony, if you had thoughts on that.
But isn't there like an element of the absurd, but also an element in truth of that? Because you just said something I didn't even remember or realize. Yes, it's like they didn't invent the time travel machine to play or to what time in history or in the future will I
Yeah.
One, it's I gotta go to college, so I need to create time travel. So that just goes to show you, like, sort of what is the saying? Twice as good, half as far.
Yeah.
And maybe not even half as far. So I was just laughing about that sort of aspirational Black excellence, which is now a hashtag, Black girl magic, Black boy joy, sort of. And I have friends I love who really have done great work creating stories underneath both umbrellas and other umbrellas, but sort of the limits of Black excellence, as folks here in the States have deemed it, should be quite evident as, we banded together with white progressives and progressives of all, from all ethnic backgrounds here in the States, elected the country's first president who was not white or not, so we elected Barack Obama, and then things just went downhill for us ever since. Not that he was a perfect candidate, my politics are left of his, but just that one act sort of, led to some disillusionment on the part of half the country. We ended up with a reality show star as president, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So ways that I almost feel like this film would not have been made not only before Black Panther, but before the Obama era, because there's a lot of critique, disillusionment, and concern, ambivalence. I would say I'm more ambivalent than any of the above. There's lots of ambivalence around Black excellence. And we think about the limitations of a respectability politic that says, if you are the best in the world at what you do, which is the way that you can kind of opt out of the wages of Blackness in the Atlantic world. So, if you become Tiger or Serena, or we can just name those exceptionalities, then you too you can transcend this condition. And we see it's not the case. So you have this genius little girl who should be working at MIT or Caltech, probably without a PhD, but she's still, we don't know. Did she get into college? I'm trying to remember. Do we know?
Yeah, I don't think that really is. It once the sort of quest begins, I don't think that's really dealt with, of course. So yeah, exactly.
They miss the event. Yeah.
Well, they miss the science. That's the big sort of thing they get. As you say, they start off
that's
with
right,
this, with this desire to do this thing for this experiment to get a scholarship, but then that kind of falls by the wayside. Almost, there's an inevitability of course their life is going to be blighted in these sorts of ways. But this film is the same year as the film Yesterday. The time kind of, well, the problem of God. Imagine a world in which people didn't know the Beatles. You're right. White people do have it tough, versus this sort of, as you say, this sort of exceptionalism.
Rock. I love the Beatles.
This exactly. Yes.
Yesterday does not.
There is that's the difference between Yesterday
and See You Yesterday. There's a really stark difference between these two movies. But what you were saying about kind of the limits of Black intelligence and also exceptionalism and the kind of recuperation of exceptionalism, or and I'll use inverted commas a bit, but essentially a sort of white narrative of the good ones. It's okay because these Black people are the good ones. To my mind, that sort of Black exceptionalism justifies that post-racial imaginary of what do you mean? We elected Obama and Will Smith's a really popular movie star. All we need to do is get Chris Rock presenting the Oscars and we're golden. And it's like, there we go. That's exactly what happened.
Chris, isn't Oprah a billionaire?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Beyonce, Jay-Z, like, what are you people complaining about?
Yeah. So that sort of exceptionalism is fraught with exactly those tensions of exceptionalism breeds, or it is another kind of bit on the fire with regards to a post-racial colourblind imaginary and all this sort of, but if we're colourblind, it's not that the problem's not there, it's just our deficiency to see it.
Can I ask about whimsy? You mentioned whimsy at the top. At the top of the show, and I wrote it down because I thought that was a really great word to describe the movie for about 17 minutes, and I'm not sure how whimsical it is after that when things kind of get serious. And I wondered what your thoughts on whimsy were, because it struck me as an interesting word to use, because where whimsical storytelling and nonsense storytelling, certainly kind of in its traditions, has had a certain political edge to it. You know, think of like, you know, Edward Lear or Lewis Carroll or people like that. Writing whimsy is not, it's not as whimsical as it sounds. It's a rejection of kind of dominant power structures and dominant intellectual culture, and that, to me, therefore, that thought quite a useful aesthetic to use in a kind of search for a new form of Black fantasy storytelling. And yet this movie sort of isn't very whimsical. And I'm reminded of I'm reminded of A Wrinkle in Time, which was accused of being far too whimsical. And I wonder if there's anything you have got to say about whimsy seems to be something this story thinks its Black protagonists can't afford to have because of the prescient concerns they've got. And that's kind of, they lose whimsy and they have to engage with the real life violence of what they're dealing with.
Really? I think that the story takes whimsy for granted, because the whimsical generally in stories like this are represented by the community. So it's like within, you think about like the long stretch of, I mean, and I can't speak for, you know, literatures outside of, out of English, but, you know, thinking about like, everything from even coming across the pond and thinking about your own recent fantastic tradition. I'm thinking about Attack the Block.
Sure.
And like, and so on the surface, it's like, you know, these lads, like, what, you know, this is not really, you know, there's no whimsy, but it's like their very culture itself is the whimsy. Sure. So I wonder if, but I agree with both of you that the film was too short. Because I think in a longer film where we did get, maybe even if Chris, they had taken it for granted that that CJ was a super genius, but still immersed us in the community and the culture. I do think that even our own creatives, Black creatives, have always, at least post transatlantic slave trade, they presented our communities as whimsical, because as points of escape in the West, you know, like the only escape we found is within, you know, from racism, oppression, et cetera, is within the community. So one of the best scenes in the film, or one of the ones I liked, was actually one of the ones that was not about time travel. Is like when we actually get to see what the 4th of July is like in Brooklyn, in those communities, because I'm not from New York. So I thought it was really kind of cool. So I guess everyday whimsy, everyday. So it's almost like, you know, I mean, it's an, you know, that's no difference than seeing, you know, everyday life in the Shire. Because I bet the Shire is more familiar to some of the viewers of that film.
Food looks better in this movie, though.
You know, the mead. I mean, I bet.
All right, fair.
Right, I don't know. And the pipe, Gandalf's pipe.
We're planning one hell of a fancy dinner party here. No, absolutely. Okay, interesting. Yes, I hadn't thought about that. Well, actually, and that leads to, if we think the film perhaps suffers from brevity, I guess, Chris, we should spend just a few moments talking about CGI and in the movie and its place within the film. I mean, if there's anything you want to say, obviously there's not a huge amount in it, but the two forms it seems to most explicitly be in is in the kind of very brief shots we get of them traveling through this sort of wormhole porthole, and indeed in the kind of ways in which their technology is visualized. They put on these visors, don't they? And they well, do you want to start us off? Is there anything you, Burning, would like to say about the use of CGI in the movie that you think is worth mentioning?
Well, I suppose when I first discovered that we were going to do this film, as I said before we kind of came on, it really did bypass me, and I can't believe it bypassed me, not because I have some incredible knowledge of all, you know, motion pictures, the talkies, nothing like, just because I would have expected to have, this is just because, this maybe is just before my Netflix subscription, so maybe that's my excuse for this one. Maybe it's also to do with the use of stars, because I think that's also really important to the way that the film obtains its meaning. But when I was first looking up, I heard it described, I mean, it's an American science fiction film, but I also saw it described, or heard it described as a superhero movie. And I was thinking, I'm not sure I agree with that But maybe I do agree with that. And what form does superheroism take in the film? But it's not that kind of superheroism, I think. But then the scenes where you have these two characters, CJ and Sebastian, playing with their toys essentially, and also running a business, sort of like the Genius Bar in the Apple Store. Other computers are available, but just something around the the use of holograms in the film, where they're visualizing their work and so forth, didn't feel out of place for some reason. It didn't feel sort of jarring. It's very much like both the Minority Report, that post-Minority Report style of using virtual holograms and sets to sort of visualize the future, and they sort of do it in the Iron Man films, I think, more than most, actually, when Tony Stark is playing with his playing with his toys and getting things wrong and allowed to get things wrong, and this fantasy of white exceptionalism. So it's very sporadic, and it's sort of treated as relatively normal. A lot of the characters, there's a degree of taken for grantedness that these children are geniuses, and by virtue of that, the film takes for granted that our ability to visualize countdown clocks on a screen, virtual holograms that the children are using to kind of visualize their experiments, aren't sort of treated in a particularly extravagant way. Whereas you cut to Avengers Endgame, there's a whole 20-minute lead in while they're just flicking their little things before they go off and time travel through the space-time continuum. But it's all very sort of pared down. But yeah, I mean, odd little visual effects and whatnot. But I just thought it was a really interesting way of using those sorts of virtual holograms to give them a sense of this is how they engage with it. They're not surprised by their abilities, and neither is the film.
Yeah, and I guess thinking about the issue that Ebony's book raises about how we can tell better stories, or more inclusive range of stories. If we're thinking about what you're saying, Ebony, audio visually, one of the things we've got to reckon with is that in the world of post-Jurassic Park, CGI technology is a key rhetoric, if you will, through which the fantastic is realized on screen. And if that rhetoric isn't accessible to certain filmmakers, to black filmmakers, then, because I mean, we could be the obvious reason there's not much CGI in the movie is I suspect the budget didn't afford that much CGI, right? But that in itself isn't a closing down of a question; it's an opening up of a question. Because why is there not enough budget for this movie to be told in a more extravagant way? And as I say, the comparison with A Wrinkle in Time strikes me as it's the only example I can think of a black-led YA fantasy with huge, opulent, beautiful CGI visuals, and yet that was seen to be there was an extravagance perceived in that movie that isn't perceived in Avengers Endgame, as Chris mentioned. So, Ebony, have you thought about this at all in terms of, I mean, that's just a raw economic problem, but I guess it's a classic case of until black filmmakers are afforded the same budgets as white filmmakers, that's another way of closing down the imaginative possibilities of black fantasy storytelling.
Absolutely. One of the things that I was troubled by is that most of the Black science fiction projects, See You Yesterday is not under this umbrella, have either been attached to Marvel or Disney properties where, the Black Creatives Project is kind of a spinoff. So, of course, Black Panther was not invented by Black authors or writers or comics artists. Of course, later on, they became some of the greatest interpreters of the character. And then Ryan Coogler is now, his vision has really shaped how contemporary audiences see the character. But that is, it's very much Marvel. It's Marvel property. And then on the other hand, the Black is King project that Beyonce did, that I felt was very Afrofuturistic in nature. People didn't understand it. One of the things that I want more of my fellow critics and artists to understand is that, there does seem to be hard line. Now, some of them have told me they snap back, they don't care because everything's not for everyone. So I get that. But Afrofuturism, if you're thinking about scaling it up, so that it gets the same audiences as, Black Panther, et cetera, without being attached to a major property. One of the things that we're going to have to think about is that a lot of it tends to be more abstract art. And Beyonce's project was like that. It was well received by her fans, but some African folks were incensed, and they said, well, Afrofuturism is a capitalist project. And while that was a misreading, I think, from some of our, kin folk on the continent, I mean, how can they be blamed for feeling that way? Because, I mean, everyone keeps telling me to sit tight. Octavia is going to be adapted. We're going to get the adaptation of Nora Jemisin and Nnedi Okorafor's work very, very soon. And we are still waiting. We've watched many a project die in development. I mean, I've been waiting for 30, 40 years for that grand adaptation of Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian revolutionaries. The Black Jacobins. We don't have any of that stuff in film. So my concern is that if the ones who are going to have the dollars to, for animation or for CGI, generally it's going to be attached to a project that's highly commodifiable. And what gets commodified in the West has got to have some traditionalism to hang its hat on. So, Black Panther, people were, complaining that it was a revolutionary. A lot of my friends said, why was there an agent in it? They made Killmonger, Eric Stevens' character became, just sort of a caricature of what the Black revolutionary or Black radical tradition says. And I thought Disney has no incentive to I wouldn't even say, sinisterly, they don't have an incentive. Some of this is they really don't know. They're not reading Black radical thought. They have not read Black Marxism. No one in the room has, except for maybe Ryan. But I'm just thinking, what are some of the hard limits to getting larger budgets for creators? Also, I was a little worried or sad that Ava DuVernay's version of A Wrinkle in Time wasn't well received by critics. I went and saw it twice, but people just really, it brings up questions of what source material can usefully be race bent or bent in any way versus, green lighting original work that isn't attached to a major billion-dollar corporation.
Yeah.
I find that's really interesting. Kind of the limits of Afrofuturism. Afrofuturism doesn't have that kind of access to opulence in these economic terms, and that Afrofuturism, as you said, is a capitalist project, or certain voices that need to then be attached to particular kinds of exploitative or exploitable commodities. I wondered whether this is the problem of kind of visual effects in this instance, because the minute you have something like A Wrinkle in Time, which leans on exactly that sort of spectacular, it becomes easily critiqued on the basis of being too much, which is of course something that is a descriptor that's used to describe all kinds of bodies. And I was thinking about the magical Negro and the sort of the way in which visual effects has contributed to, I remember that when we did the episode on Aladdin with Will Smith, Will Smith was in the film, not on the podcast, just make that clear. When we did the episode on Aladdin with Will Smith, with somebody else, I think we were kind of talking about the way in which visual effects is then used to sort of amplify and make magical this image of the magical Negro. And I just wondered whether there's a strange audience response to something like A Wrinkle in Time, which is the minute the technology, the affordances that are available to other kinds of movies are attached to a film like A Wrinkle in Time with a predominantly black cast, there's a sense in which there's a resistance to that, and there's an audience resistance to that sort of opulence, that somehow they shouldn't have access to that, or there's something around. I don't know what it is, but I had not really thought about that in terms of industrial and economic. Who gets to make this kind of fantasy film? Who gets to make this kind of science fiction film before? And kind of connecting that to a broader industry discussion of being in the room where it happens.
I think we need to know more about what people dream of. So
Yeah.
thinking about escape and how, our imaginations have been fed and seeded,
Yeah.
especially during our formative years, which kinds of characters or which characters are seen as indicative of escape and which are not. Currently, we're fighting some battles in one of the oldest media speculative fandoms, Star Trek, over Alex Kurtzman's era at the helm of the franchise. And he's diversified everything. So Star Trek Discovery, someone complained recently, has no cisgender heterosexual white men in the show. Now Doug Jones is, but he's playing an alien. And but we have one of the greatest cisgender white male characters probably of the past 20 years, like just playing a Western cowboy in the middle of this Anson Mounts Captain Christopher Pike. He's amazing. I mean, and to the point where one of our amazing Trek fans who does, a vlog, Jesse Gender, actually said this is actually a template for how not only are white men not being erased in the future with this Black woman captain, this actually shows a way forward. Like he's he's not even toxically masculine, but he's very much a dude, there's a way to do it. But even that is not satisfactory for that critic. And so that's going to be an inhibitor in the future. I think the question isn't just about representation, it's about centering. So I think one of the things that some of the guys in the fandom are faced with is this sort of decentering of, not even as they're not even secondary characters, what it means to be sitting on the sidelines, sitting on the margins, being the recurring character instead of having, that avatar of the self straight in the middle of the narrative. And I mean, if you look at other big budget fantasy and science fiction that's been greenlit, you just don't have that most places. Even the Wheel of Time series that just got cast, there's some really good, avatar. I don't really have, there's a couple of characters who are, I think, Black women. And that's some of the objection to Foundation, because, after Jared Harris, I mean, y'all know Foundation. So after Jared Harris's character does what he does, two of the most important characters in this reimagining of Asimov, who is not noted for his character development, just say the least, right? Are Black, like a Black, two Black characters. And it's like, wait a minute, when I was reading my, Foundation and Empire, I read all those books too. I didn't even imagine those characters as Black. Now, I did write about that in The Dark Fantastic, that I think millennials and Generation Z, because they had slightly more diverse media than I grew up with during my earliest years, I think they're able to see themselves into books that I just knew, this is a good book. I don't see myself in it, but cool, just reading it. I think that that's going to be a problem, because the visual element is something people ask me about in The Dark Fantastic. They, when I talk about it, they're saying, well, what is it a problem if the character, the reader is told that the character is a person of color, but then when they see the person of color, they have to then unsee all of their prior reading and viewing that says people of color belong in certain places. I also think that's where you're getting audience discomfort. Even looking at some of the reviews, people just don't like CJ Claudette, the character. She's too fill in the blank. And that's fine, because, you can have we're not all likable. We're not all likable. But, so there are lots of thoughts. I just think that the next I was about to say the next frontier, and I'm checking my own language because that's very colonial, but the next step really has to be thinking about moving the audience so that they will be receptive to seeing all kinds of characters in all kinds of ways.
Yeah. It's a really delicate, I don't know what it's a really difficult back and forth, isn't it, between pushing a fan community on through the texts they engage with and pushing the texts along as a response to the fan community that they're supposed to serve, and which goes first and which needs to be pulled along with them. hegemonic backlash. So yeah, but that's another podcast.
Another one
for yesterday, and that's how we bring it back to the one we're talking about. Yes. So yeah, unfortunately, maybe right now, where just as much as the film ends on a kind of this is where we are right now note, where we are right now is that these movies, they're released on Netflix. Netflix is ubiquitous. I'm sure this has been watched by a lot more people than an equivalent would have been 10 years ago, these mid-budget movies. So there is hope in that, I guess, but they are still stuck in these, to use your word. I like the word stuck. In these spaces where there is more to do. And there is more to do, I'm sure, on another show, but I think this one, unfortunately, his time is probably run up. So, I mean, Ebony, thank you so much for both introducing us to a movie that we might not have seen otherwise. So thank you for that, and for spending time talking to us. It's been a pleasure to speak to you and to meet you over the last hour or so, and really great to put a face and a voice to a book that will continue to be cited on this podcast when we watch more stuff.
Thank you so much. This has been so fun.
Oh, that's very kind. Well, yeah, ditto for us too. Is there anything we should be plugging, Ebony? Is there the novel's not out yet because we're still stuck in the time loop, are we? Or is it about to come out? Or is there any projects? Can listeners follow you on Twitter anywhere?
Sure. So next year I have an edited collection out with my dear friend Sarah Park Dallin. It's called Harry Potter and the Other: Race, Justice, Difference in the Wizarding World, and that will be out from the University Press of Mississippi. So it's University of Mississippi's Press in July 2022. So please do pick it up. We do deal with Rowling's comments and her stances that she has received a lot of public backlash for. And we did invite a wonderful trans author or non-binary author to write a chapter directly about that, because the book's been in development for years, and then we felt we had to address it, and we do in the introduction and in this featured chapter.
That sounds terrific. I'll make sure to get that on my wish list. Metaphorical, not Amazonian. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for that. And listeners can check that out if they're listening in the future. Then they can check it out right now. If you've been provoked by anything we've been saying, you can get involved in the conversation at fantasy-animation.org. Write a blog post, response. You can tweet us at fananimresearch, FANANIM research, Instagram as well, and Facebook. Why not send us an email, fananimresearch@gmail.com as well as that. But otherwise, that's been us for an episode, and we will see you next time.
Bye.